and welcome to Off the Shelf, the half-terming library vlog. I'm Mr. Humphreys.
And I'm Miss Rio.
Okay, so what have we got for you this episode? Well, first up, we've got some recommendations for Year 7 to 9, starting with this rather snappily titled book, or a mouthful maybe, The Undying of Obedience, Well Rest. Great title, right, by Nicholas Bowling. Now, we all have a bit of Gothic, yes, don't we? And so this is the latest from an author who does a bit of historical horror, I suppose you could say. He dabbles in that. And he deserves, to me, in my mind, he deserves a wider audience than he actually has.
I agree with that too.
We love Nicholas Bowling. So this story focuses on the eponymous Obedience Well Rest. That is actually her name, in case you're wondering. and now she's a 16-year-old who's essentially rubbing up against the patriarchy back in the 18th century. And she has to deal with a very overly protective father who wants to marry off to a very renowned scientist who's he's a bit of a wrong un, bit of a ne'er-do-well. He's he's a bit devious, a bit cunning, and he sort of has a bit of, let's say, dirt, a bit of blackmail on the Well Rest family. But it's not just her who's the protagonist. We've also got a young guy by the name of Ned. Now, Ned is a grave digger, and there is some body snatching afoot in his graveyard. So now their destinies, basically, in the dual narrative, their destinies essentially intertwine. So it is very dark, but it's also very exciting, very thrilling, and actually it's perhaps a little more sweeter than it sounds as well in terms of the story, which might not sound like at first glance. Now, you also won't be surprised with the references to the body snatching and the grave digging. It does reference yet another, once again, that very classic Gothic story of Frankenstein as well. Yep. So perfect for that as well. So yeah, certainly a recommended read for fans of Gothic, which is most of us. Next up, I've got A Way with Words by Sophie Cameron, and you can see there's a pun there. A way is one word, because obviously we've all heard the saying, he has a way with words, she has a way with words, but this is like going away with words. So what's going on here? Now, this book is on a shortlist of a book award that we're taking part in for the first time, the Spark Schools Book Awards, okay? And because of the first time in this award, they've got a category for secondary schools, and so that we're taking part. Now, this is my personal favourite, A Way with Words, of the shortlisted titles, and it features a very novel and unique concept in this world, in this sort of like alternative world to ours. When people say the words, they physically manifest themselves above their heads. Okay. Other than that, the world is very much it is very much like our own. Okay, so it's not like a high fantasy. It's just a sort of our world with a twist, if you like. And it features a protagonist. What's her name again? Gala. Now, she's moved over from Spain against her will, with her father and his partner, so they can settle in his partner's hometown where he works as a teacher. So she's been forced against her will, and she's not very happy. But she then befriends a girl in the school who's got selective mutism. So there's like very important themes going on here. Communication, friendship, starting in a new environment, kind of like we do with the Read Up books. So it's a little bit wonder, because it's got a very good choose kind message, and it's also a little bit being Miss Nobody with the the selective mutism angle as well. So yeah, you get the idea. So it's a very thought provoking book with great appeal. Definitely that one. And then last but not least, How to Say No to Your Phone by Brad Marshall. Now, before you roll your eyes, because I know that you must have it up to here with us teachers and your parents and every other adult you can think of telling you that you mustn't use your phone too much, your phone is bad for you. Now, before you roll your eyes, I'm just going to show you how this book starts off. Let's begin by calling out the elephant in the room. Phones are not bad. They offer convenient ways to communicate with our friends and family. They help to capture and share our important moments, and we can use them to relax and have fun, on something we can fit in our pockets. The challenge is, when something can do all that and it is present all of the time, it can quickly consume our lives. Okay, so that's the point. So yeah, it's precisely because of this that this book is necessary, essentially. We should also add, it's not just young people who struggle with having too much time on their phone. We all do. Everyone does. Just a quick glance when you're next on the train or on the bus, just a quick glance around will tell you that people can't take their eyes off their phone. Okay, so it's important for all of us to manage that. So it's important to acknowledge that actually phones aren't all bad in the first place, but it's more about how it's a difficult habit to break because it consumes your lives, like they say, and it shouldn't. You shouldn't be enslaved by this small cube in your pocket, essentially. So what they do, the authors, it's not like they don't do a boot camp. They're not like a sergeant major yelling at you. They sort of like break it down on the path to achieving moderation. because it's not abstinence, it's moderation. Yeah, how
Balance.
you use your phone. Balance. Yep, that's the perfect word for it. So rather than shaming you into changing habits, they set out a sort of like a 10-step program, and in each of those 10 steps, they've got a practical toolkit on how to do it. So like small steps. So it's good for all of us really, because all of us do use our phones too much. Miss Maria, do you think you use your phone too much?
I think I used to. I think recently I've tried to sort of find, good balance with it and use it when I need it. And other times I think, actually, I don't need to go on it right now. I'll just, look at what's around me or just take a bit of time. I think that's,
And that's what they say in this book. They say take the time to look up your screen, the world around you. So, well, Miss Reard probably doesn't need this book as much as I do, or some other people do. So it's definitely a good lifestyle habit book. Yeah.
But it is so easy. It's so easy just to, waiting for the bus or for the train or just
got a few minutes to kill, and it is designed to be addictive. So.
Yeah, that's true.
So there you go. So that's what we have for year 7 to 9 this episode.
All right. Now, here's what we've got new in the library for 10 and up. I'm going to start with 2 fiction, and then I've got a non-fiction book. I'm going to start with this one, which is called That Selfsame Metal, which, starting off, just the title of that intrigued me enough. And this is a fantasy historical fiction novel about a girl called Joan Sands, and she is employed at the Globe Theatre to direct Shakespeare and his troupe in stage combat. So that's the premise of the book. But there is a twist. She has been blessed by, they don't really say what, but sort of the Fae, to be able to control metal.
Okay.
So
it's like X-Men. It's like Magneto in X-Men.
Yeah, it's quite. It sounds quite complicated, but it makes sense as you read it, and it's really interesting. But no one really knows. So she is working with, metal every day, working with stage combat, and she's extremely good at it. But everyone just thinks she's very well trained, but really she sort of has this power in this way to speak with the metal to know what it wants to do and how she should use it, and so it makes her very good at her job.
Yeah, I'd say.
But the sort of crux of this story is, I've got it written down here, when a pact between the ancient spirits and the Fae is broken, Joan stands as the city's only hope with her unique gift, and alone she must battle the threat to save London and fulfill her destiny. Ooh. So there's a lot going on here, but I think it's a really interesting take on historical fiction and weaving fantasy and fairy stories with that. So if that's something you're interested in, I think this is a good one to pick up. I found a quote from Leigh Bardugo, who is obviously very popular, and she said, "Perfect for anyone looking for a fresh take on fairy magic." So that kind of tells you everything you need to know. But this also particularly took my attention because Shakespeare is a character in this book. And I read a little bit of it, and he crops up quite often. And in past Litzocs and things like that, we've spoken quite a lot about stories or novels with Shakespeare written in as a character, not his stories reimagined or his stories fictionalised, but he is a character in the story. So this is sort of a new, more modern twist on that. So, there's kind of a lot going on. But if you like historical fantasy...
more historical fantasy
one.
there.
Yeah,
Definitely.
Yeah, maybe similar, but for an older audience.
Yeah, of course.
That's my non-fiction. So the next fiction one this is probably more for sixth form, I'd say. It's a bit denser, but I think it's still an interesting read if you're, year 10 or 11 and you want to sort of get wider reading when it comes to historical fiction. And this is The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho. And actually, they tie in quite nicely together, all my books. They're sort of themed.
Well done, linked.
I did it without realising. But this is written by the actor Patterson Joseph. I don't know if you're aware of him. He's in a few comedy things, but he's also a writer and he writes plays himself. And it chronicles the life of Charles Ignatius Sancho, and he was the first black man to vote in Britain. And it has been fictionalised into a novel from Patterson's same play that he wrote, which is called Sancho, an Act of Remembrance. So he clearly knows the story of this man very well and is
He's an expert,
weaving it into lots of different fictionalised forms. But the pull for this is it's written in his voice, And the tagline says, "It's time for him to tell his story, one that begins on a tempestuous Atlantic Ocean and ends at the very centre of London life. And through it all he must ask, born amongst death, how much can you achieve in one short life?"
Okay.
Basically, he's just a really, really fascinating man. I'm sure, I don't think there's any pictures in here, but there's quite a few famous portraits of him that you might recognise. And it's someone I was somewhat aware of, but this basically goes as deep into his life from the information that we're left as you can want. And yeah, he's so fascinating. Like I said, he's the first man to vote in Britain. He sort of holds consort with the king. He writes and plays highly acclaimed music, which was inspired lots of other pieces that followed. And yeah, it's all from his point of view. So if you want to know more about quite an important voice in our Black British history from his point of view, and written by a Black British man.
Yes.
This
Added
is a great
authenticity,
place to go. Yeah.
And yeah, like you said, it sounds like he really knows his stuff as well.
Yeah, he's
Inside
written
out,
so many different things about him, so I'm sure he's done a lot of research. But yeah, I mean, it also just looks wonderful. It's well written.
That
it's all in
beautiful cover.
I know,
must
it's
say.
so nice.
It's-
That's mostly one of the things that lured me in. If anything has this gold foiling, I know I'm
Yeah.
like it, which I know we're not supposed to judge it, but it, it's the first thing you see, so you can't really help yourself.
There's nothing wrong with a nice cover.
No. Oh,
Yes.
There's also a signed copy that we have in the library, so
There we
there
go.
you go. But yeah, I just thought that sounded quite interesting. As you can imagine, maybe a bit more for sixth form than perhaps year 10, but if you're feeling ambitious and you want to give it a go, then
Go for it.
go for it. And lastly is my non-fiction choice, which is Femina by Janina Ramirez. And this is basically writing women back into history, simply put. And it says it gives voice to influential women of the Middle Ages who have been silenced by the male gatekeepers of the time and of more modern history. And it just highlights forgotten pioneers, women in history who did important things during the Middle Ages, and sort of talks about how easy it is for historical narratives and stories to be manipulated when they're written by certain types of people and in certain time periods. You don't just take one book written by a certain person in the 80s as complete fact in history. So this one kind of teaches you about understanding the context of written history, but also just giving a voice to these women. It's also, there's a lot about the Middle Ages in general and how it's sort of seen as the Dark Ages and how that taints our idea of that time period and the sort of technological, artistic advances that maybe came out of it, that actually it shouldn't be called the Dark Ages and why it's been called the Dark Ages. So yeah, it's just an interesting one if you're interested in that time period, but particularly women's experience during that time and individual stories of women who made waves.
And we certainly need those narratives, because we talked about books like this before. We want her stories, not just histories. So definitely good to have another great one added to the ranks.
Again, maybe slightly more for sixth form, because it does seem a little bit more dense, but it breaks it down through different themes. So we've got movers and shakers, decision makers, warriors, leaders, artists. So you can kind of choose what sort of story you're interested in, maybe what you feel is a bit more accessible for you. So yeah.
All right.
Just very historical.
It is very historical, but that's okay, Miss Rio, because we know how much you love your history.
I do, but they all kind of weave quite nicely.
They do. As you said, they're all linked.
They are, yeah. So,
accidentally, not premeditated. No, of course not.
Happy accident.
Okay, thank you, Miss Rio. Okay, so on to part 2 of our latest episode, and that means our special guest. Now, our special guest this episode is another friend of the library, another person who you see frequently in here borrowing books. She is devours books constantly. She is working with you so many series, and it's Miss Spears. So Miss Spears is going to tell us about some of her reading likes, habits, dislikes. So over to you, Miss Spears.
A recent read I enjoyed was this book, Julia, by Sandra Newman. It was recommended to me for the Christmas holidays by Mr. Humphreys. It is a book written about the female character Julia from George Orwell's 1984. So it's set entirely from her perspective, and it's a really kind of cool, fun, fresh look at the world of 1984, but from her side of things. So she meets Winston Smith She works in the Ministry of Fiction, also in the fiction department in the Ministry of Truth. It's just a really interesting look at 1984 from a totally different side of things. And I really liked that Sandra Newman uses the speech and style of George Orwell, but in a totally different way. It's great. Favourite book from my childhood? I really struggled with this one, but I think ultimately one stands out, which is Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. I've probably read it countless times. I love the character of Anne. I love the story of kind of friendship and family. It's about a girl called Anne who's an orphan who's adopted by a kind of couple. They live in Canada in Prince Edward Island. She's adopted by Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert, and it's all about kind of the kind of trials and tribulations of Anne as a kind of young woman growing up, going to school, meeting her friends, getting into scrapes. But it's really kind of heartwarming, and I just go back to it again and again. I think a book I read recently was People Person by Candice Carty-Williams. I like the book. It probably wasn't my favourite book, but afterwards I thought this would make a really good TV series or film. It's about 5 half-siblings with 4 different mothers but the same father, and it's set when they're in their 20s and 30s. Over the years they've kind of briefly met each other once or twice, but they don't really know each other. But then a kind of catastrophic event happens and it brings them all together. It's set in South London, which I really enjoyed reading, because you kind of recognise the places and names of areas, and it's just how they kind of come together as a unit. And it's all about kind of family and relationships, and slightly wacky at times, but it's really enjoyable. So I think it's quite episodic. It could be a really good TV series based around the different characters. I think the book that left the strongest impression was one called Outlaw Ocean by someone called Ian Urbina. It's a series of chapters. It was originally a kind of investigative series of journalism pieces written for the New York Times that's been put into a book. But it's essentially about kind of illegal activity and crime in international waters. So each chapter is about something totally different. So it's really accessible, I think, to read, because you can just dip in and out of the chapters. But it goes into things like illegal fishing, modern slavery, what else does it go into? Kind of crime, piracy. But I think it's something I had no awareness of. And I think it's kind of changed how I view the ocean more generally. And it's definitely impacted how I eat fish and kind of my own habits as well in life. So yes, that left probably the biggest mark. Okay, 3 Desert Island books. I took a while to think of this just because I wanted to think about what I'd like to be with for a long period of time. As a classicist, my first had to be the Iliad by Homer. It's just my favourite piece of Greek literature, set in the final year of the Trojan War, around the character of Achilles. And it's just such a beautiful, moving, kind of dramatic story about war and relationships. It's amazing. My second is probably a favourite book. I was torn between The Northern Lights and Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman, but I've gone with Amber Spyglass. I think I love The Northern Lights because of its kind of, you enter the world of Philip Pullman, but I think the Amber Spyglass pipped it at the end. I think the kind of emotional thrust of the end of the book, of the kind of series, with Will and Lyra, and kind of finding out how dust exists and its impact on the world. I think I'll go with the Amber Spyglass. And then my final one, I chose Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. it's just a book I can go back to again and again. I love Elizabeth Bennet, the family. I love the kind of wry humour. I love the social commentary. So I think that would be my third book.
Thank you, Miss Spears. Next up, I have a little bit of trivia, which actually is relevant to some of the the books that I spoke about.
More links.
More links. So, seeing as one of these books includes William Shakespeare himself, I thought a Shakespeare fact would have been apt. Did you know that William Shakespeare is credited with the invention of over 1,700 words in the English language, and phrases as well, but they're still used in English today? And there'll definitely be some in this list that you'll recognise. For example, uncomfortable, fashionable, manager, critic. More that you'll know, but I couldn't list them all.
No.
There's so many famous words and sort of unique phrases that Shakespeare coined and came up with that we still use. So,
And that is why we still study him.
he is a pioneer of the English language. But when you're reading the book with Shakespeare bear that in mind. All right, next up we have our pupil librarian section. So, away with it, pupil librarians.
I was scared of dentists and the dark. I was scared of pretty girls and starting conversations. All my friends are turning green. Yeah, the magician's assistant in their dream. Oh, and they come unstuck. Lady, running down to the riptide, taken away to the dark side. I wanna be your left-hand man. I love you when you're singing that song, and I got a lump in my throat 'cause you're gonna sing the words wrong. Is this movie that I think you like? This guy decides to quit his job and head to New York City. This cowboy's running from himself. She's been living on the highest shelf. Oh.
All right, thank you very much to our pupil librarians. So that rounds up episode 14 of Off the Shelf.
Yeah.
Keep reading, and we'll see you soon. Bye.